Hi, Sir Richard. It's Richard Rossi. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a great pleasure.
Allow me to introduce Sophia, one of our delegates, who is going to be asking the delegates questions of you. Hello, Sophia.
Hi, Sir Richard. My name is Victoria Ainello, and I want to thank you for being here with me today. It's a privilege to conduct this interview on behalf of my fellow delegates and as an aspiring biochemist myself.
Good.
My
it's a
first
pleasure
question.
to be here. And I hear you come from Nahant.
I do, yes.
We should, yes, that's very close. We should make contact and get together.
I would love to. I've had experience actually at the biolabs in Beverly, so it would be amazing to work with you there.
Excellent. Okay.
But to get started, I would love to ask, how can we, as future scientists, spread awareness against this false notion of the dangers of GMOs and even using genetic modification in agriculture as a whole?
Well, I think one of the things that we really need to do is to make sure that people who have knowledge in this area talk to their friends. I think for the case of students, once they grasp the basics of what it's all about, talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents. I will say it's very good for students to take the grandmother test. In the grandmother test, you talk to your grandmother and talk about science in a way that she will understand and can then tell all her friends what a smart scientist you are because you understand this stuff.
Definitely. And in the age of the computer and information, it's even more important to understand what we're talking about. So in addition to that, how can we find better information to further educate ourselves on controversial topics like GMOs?
Well, in the case of GMOs, you can come to my website where there is a lot of information, but there is a tremendous amount of good science that is available, but you often have to search for it. Because unfortunately, social media has turned out to be very, very good at promulgating notions that are anti-science. They're fiction. An awful lot of rubbish gets promulgated, and especially conspiracy theories and so on, because I think people like to hear this. Whereas the good science rarely makes it on social media in any way, and you need to go and look for it. And very often, if you ask your science teacher at school, they will point you in the direction of resources. If you're interested in the public literature, you go down to the National Library of Medicine, where there are many, many useful resources that are all geared towards medical topics of one sort and another. And they too will include information about GMOs. But published papers can be very helpful. Good reviews can make a huge difference in explaining what the truth really is.
Thank you for pointing us to these sources that will actually help us better our opinions. But in addition to that, a lot of these sources may contradict or argue with each other. So what is your opinion on the emergence of bioethics debates regarding genetics as the field extends to mammals rather than plants?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you know, bioethics is a very interesting topic, and quite often we get bogged down by people who tell you how dangerous things are and how you just simply shouldn't do them because they're too dangerous. And I would like to take one example that is very important just at the moment, and this is the question of vaccines against COVID-19. How should we test those vaccines? The traditional way is to go and do random trials among very large numbers of people, and it's a very slow process. But there is another way one could do it. One could find some volunteers, and actually thousands of people have already volunteered for this, where they would be given the vaccine and then challenged after a week or 2 weeks with the virus, deliberately given the virus to see if the vaccine works. These are called challenge trials. They have been done in some instances previously, but in general, the medical community has been very hesitant to do that. However, in this case, I would very strongly advocate for this approach because life is being slowed down. Your ability to go to school and learn is being slowed down because we do not have good preventative measures. A vaccine is desperately needed if we are to return to normal life.
Very interesting. And speaking of COVID-19, Do you see any places where genetic modification may play a role in how we begin to treat the spread and ongoing vaccine generation with this virus?
Well, I think the only place that I'm aware of is something that George Church also mentioned, that you can use CRISPR techniques in order to develop better tests. But I think in terms of trying to solve the disease, genetic engineering or trying to modify genomes is not the way to go. We have much better ways of dealing with infectious diseases.
Very interesting. Thank you. Speaking of yourself and your experience, as a biochemist with a variety of options of study to choose from, delegates would like to know what got you interested in working in agriculture.
I don't work in agriculture. So the first thing is that, I'm a molecular biologist. I work on bacteria. I work on DNA, bioinformatics. I got interested in agriculture, first of all, because Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize in 1984, and was at Cold Spring Harbor. I knew her quite well, and so I've always had some interest in agriculture. But the real reason I got started on this particular move was because I went to a symposium celebrating the 80th birthday of Mark van Montague in Belgium. And all I heard during this symposium were European agricultural people saying how difficult it was to do research because of the anti-GMO movement. They'd essentially shut it down. And I was appalled by this. I thought this was terrible, because here is a technique, a technology, a new technology that could have as much impact as cell phones on the population in Africa. The highest cell phone population in the world is probably in Africa. Everybody has a cell phone there. The GMO approach to improve their crops so they can grow better crops is vital for them. And yet the Europeans are busy trying to stop it. And I was so appalled that prompted me to start this Nobel campaign.
Wow, thank you so much. I think that with the rise of GMOs, a lot of our delegates are asking, is it true that consuming too many of these vitamins in these plants that have been genetically modified can lead to birth defects? Or are there other things that we need that can cause developmental issues if there's too many of those vitamins in the foods we're ingesting?
Well, the food that is being genetically engineered is not going to be sold here in the US or in Europe for sort of that kind of thing, for putting in more vitamins. In the case of golden rice, which would not be widely consumed here, but would be widely consumed in China or in elsewhere, I think the chances of getting too much are very low. And in general, when we try to improve crops, when agricultural people try to improve crops, they're usually looking for increased yield, for resistance to drought, for resistance to insects, the pests that are destroying the crops. They're not usually spending a lot of time on increased nutrition for sale in the US or in Europe or whatever. Although in some cases, you could argue that would be worth doing. But it tends to be in the developing countries where they are really vitamin poor. They can't go round to the local chemist and buy vitamin tablets in order to take what they need. And you don't hear very often about vitamin overdoses. Yet here they're widely available.
It's definitely sad to see first world countries kind of giving GMOs this bad reputation and not allowing these developing countries to really deal with the world hunger crisis. So in our final minute or so, I would love to ask you, what is your vision for how GMOs could engineer more abundant supplies of food to help with the world hunger crisis? And if so, how could we, as future scientists and leaders of the medical community, help to ensure a future in which this happens?
Well, I think the real issue is we need to make sure that the politicians in the developing world embrace the idea that GMOs are safe and don't put onerous regulations in place. The regulations governing traditional breeding are very lax, whereas those for GMOs are incredibly stringent. I think in the case of conventional plants, we need to put a little more emphasis on the product. Is the product safe? In the case of GMOs, we should focus on the product and not focus on the method by which they're made. And I think the way in which young people everywhere can help with this is by talking, by giving the facts to their friends, to their families, and ultimately to their politicians. There are quite a lot of young people in Africa who are really pushing the pro-GMO agenda. I met some ladies recently from something called an organization called Women Who Farm in Africa. And they are very pro-GMO, and they are trying to convince the local politicians to ease up on the regulations so they can introduce these crops. And the nice thing is that local scientists in Africa can do it for themselves. They don't need big US agribusinesses to come and take over that side of things. Local scientists can actually make these improved crops themselves pretty easily.
That's some great advice. Thank you so much. I'm sure that all the delegates that are watching this right now really love to hear from you. And I want to thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you in front of my delegates today.
Okay, you're very welcome, and I do hope we get the chance to meet.
I would love that. Thank you.
Good.
Hey, it's Richard. And Faith, you did an outstanding job. We'll be sure to get you Sir Richard's contact information. I expect you to follow up right away. And Sir Richard, as always,
I do too.
an enormous pleasure and honor to have you with our 2,700 delegates today. And I so much hope you will come back and join us again.
I will indeed. All you have to do is ask me.
Thank you, sir, and both of you, good job.